Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. We are back at the new studios over on North Main Street. I want to thank Jay Round from coming over from Rhode Island Bio, one of the innovators going on in the state of Rhode Island. But, you know, just about everybody is yearning to hear from the money man, Gary Sasse. He is back on the set. We actually, just so everyone understands, Gary Sasse made us build these fancy new studios. He demands fancy new studios. Welcome back. Where you been?
Demanding excellence is where
Demanding excellence. So let's jump into demanding excellence. Let's go. We've got a number of topics to talk about. Let's start with state aid to education. There was a new report kicked off last week on the Senate side, and it says What's the average person supposed to understand about this new proposal?
Well, let me put it in perspective, if I might. A decade ago, in 2010, the state was probably the only state in the union that didn't have a school aid formula. And they enacted something called the Education Equity and Property Tax Relief Act. And just stated very simply, the purpose was to try to improve equity among the districts in financing education.
How'd they do, by the way?
I think they work. I think there's some things that need to be fixed, which the report talks about. But I think it did fairly well. Between 2012 and 2020, state support for education grew by over $280 million. It grew by over 4% a year when inflation was at 2%. And that doesn't include money that was put into some other programs like early childhood and career tech. So they certainly came forward with the money. Now, this is where the problem developed. They instituted something called a foundation program. And a foundation program basically said that every kid had to have a core instructional amount. Mm-hmm. And the core instructional amount was divided into two piles. One pile was states, where they defined the core instructional amount, and currently it's about $9,900. The second pile was the local share. And they determined the local share, and I won't go through the math and the weeds of a share ratio of what percentage each community should contribute based on its property tax wealth and its equalized weighted assessed valuation and number of kids, et cetera. And that number was about $3,900. So the combination of $10,000 and $3,000, the foundation program was about $13,000. And it worked pretty well. But we've come to find out that there are some problems with it. And the first problem is that it is not equitably achieved that goal in some very poor districts. There are 3 districts in the state where it's not working. And those 3 districts are Woonsocket, Pawtucket, and Providence. And coincidentally, those districts have 45% of the kids we define as kids in poverty. Mm-hmm. They have about 70% of the kids that are English learning students. And the reason that it hasn't worked, and I'll give you some numbers which are astounding, is those communities did not have the ability, the will, or the fiscal capacity to come up with the local share. So the state did its job in funding the foundation program for everybody, but in those urban...
But if you're at about 13, 14 on those foundational funding levels, Providence is at about 17, 18,000 per pupil.
Yeah, but they defined foundation based on what was in the market basket for regional schools. Didn't include some transportation, didn't include some high-cost special ed, and some of the other things. And so the question becomes, how do you compel, or can you compel, those communities to appropriate enough money so the formula achieves its objective of providing equal resources? And the numbers are big. In Woonsocket, for example, it's about $2,300 per kid that the locals are not providing. In Pawtucket, it's about $1,500. In Providence, it's about $300 per kid. So the first issue that the report talks about is compelling municipalities to annually fund their share of the core instructional amount.
Let's just stay in Providence for 1 second. Your friends over at the CEO roundtable who gave Ernst & Young a few $100,000 to come up with a study. Ernst & Young identified that there's enough money in the Providence system. It's just not always being spent in the right place. One of the couple areas that they identified was on transportation and on basic maintenance of the buildings and things like that.
Well, the maintenance got behind, and they're right. You know, you have maintenance problems when you don't take care of facilities, and that was done for not just years, but done
But their contractual obligations seem to be things that need to be reformed.
Yeah, certainly, but I don't agree that you can fix the Providence schools without additional resources. But we do know this: separate the amount you need from the equity of where it comes from.
Okay.
And Providence is not putting up what's required to equitably fund schools statewide. They need to put up another $300 per student. And so the issue is, how do you compel them to do that? And there are several conversations going on. We've been working, that's Hassan Institute and the Rhode Island Association of School Committees, with the 6 districts in Rhode Island that had over 50% of their kids in poverty. And
was Providence at the table there?
I think Providence is invited, but no, they're the turnaround community.
They're the turnaround community of the day, right?
Yeah,
the flavor of the day?
Yeah, these other communities have the same demographics, and they should not be shunted aside.
Yeah, and their school systems are equally poor, based on test results.
Well, financially, Pawtucket and Woonsocket have much less capacity to fund schools than Providence does. And so where people are working on that. The report that came out from the legislature basically said the Department of Education ought to report on that. We ought to get a better picture of what's happening. But we think you have to compel the municipality to come up with what's required. Otherwise, the foundation program doesn't equalize. The other thing you have to do is you have to better define what you mean by poverty. It's free and reduced lunch, but not all kids apply for free and reduced lunch. So there are 2 suggestions. One suggestion that's come from the committee, which is a good one, is that when we count the kids, the poverty factor, there's something in the formula called a student success factor, which adds 40% for each student that's under 185% of poverty, and it's managed through the free and reduced lunch. They suggested some change to that you consider kids who are English learners in that equation. We have another solution. It's basically to have an urban success factor and recognize there are some urban overburden issues that need to be dealt with. But that's the first issue that needs to be dealt with, defining poverty and make sure the formula works to equalize as it is intended. There are others. You mentioned before what Providence spent. There are categorical programs, the big categorical programs, high-cost special ed and transportation, particularly transportation inter-district. It's being underfunded by about $12 million a year. Hits hardest on the urban areas. So we need to fix up categories.
So does this funding formula being proposed, this framework that Pearson is the chair of, is he saying that money needs to move from suburban communities over to the urban? Or that we need to increase overall funding to Rhode Island schools?
We need increased funding. We need to at least $12 million to adequately fund the categorical programs. We need additional money in the cities to make sure they come up with their fair share of the foundation program. But it's also beyond money. He suggests certain reforms that are linked to the money. Because I get a kick out of these people saying we're going to fix up schools and we're not going to invest more money. That should be die in its own way. But he suggests certain things for charter schools, for example. The way charter schools are financed, and I'm pro-choice, let me make that very clear, but the way charter schools are financed, the money follows the kid. Well, some kids end up in charter schools that are not performing as well as the public school. Others are performing much better.
Yeah.
And so there's some suggestions to fix that up, that if the charter school is not performing, they don't get 100% reimbursement. He also talks about...
Wait, hold on there, though. If you're saying that, listen, underperforming public schools need more money even though they're underperforming, and there's charter schools that are underperforming, but the dollars follow the student, why would that underperforming charter school do better if you took away more money?
Well, that's the choice question. If parents, and I agree with parents wanting to get their kids out of failing schools, but if the state then is going to fund, pay the cost, there ought to be a quality issue. There ought to be an accountability issue. Why would you take money away from a public district if the kid is going into a situation where he's not going to get a better chance? And I think that's the...
Well, except for in the case of Providence, that would be every school, every public school is underperforming except for classical and about two others.
No, you misunderstood me. It's when you look at the way charters are funded, the dollar follows the kid. If the charter school
But if they stay at the school, the dollars follow the kid.
No, but if the charter school is performing as well or better than the public school, not an issue. The $100, the dollar follows the kid.
Right.
If the charter school is not performing as well as the public school, then less of the dollars follow. I think it makes perfect sense because...
Well, that's only going to degrade, under your premise, the quality of that charter.
It may degrade maybe the charter should close. And maybe it
But isn't that ultimately, isn't that the Commissioner of Education's job?
Well,
if there's a charter that's perennially underperforming, year in, year out, there's no uniqueness to the population that they're serving. And the same true for the public school, the regular public school. We have the vast majority of Providence public schools, Central Falls schools, Pawtucket schools, West Warwick schools, Woonsocket schools, have been for decades underperforming.
There's two issues, and you will raise a very important issue, and that's about RIDE. And RIDE should be doing a more aggressive, vigorous job of auditing all schools, including charter schools. And one of the recommendations that came from this report is that we ought to reinvent RIDE.
Yeah.
I won't say that we should take a bomb and blow it up, but if you read between the lines, it talks about building the capacity at RIDE. So for decades, RIDE's culture was one of compliance and regulation, and they want to change the culture based on legislation that was passed to have one that supports and helps build a system. Well, you need to change, people. This year, the governor's requested about another $1 million to put the staffing into RIDE. But I think there's a more fundamental issue. If you can have site-based management, if you're going to deal with more constant and vigorous audits of what's happening in our public school systems, and then work with the communities to address any audit issues that are found, you need to put resources in RIDE. But just giving RIDE money without changing RIDE, without building its capacity, could be a waste of money. So part of the recommendation is to really restructure and refix RIDE. And I think some of the success, not tomorrow, not next month, but over the next 3 or 4 years, of whether this new commissioner is successful here, is what RIDE is going to look like 2 or 3 years from now, because what it looks like right now is not very good.
So let's talk about the commissioner's office right now. Anecdotally, what you constantly hear is where she focuses her time and energy, there seems to be incremental improvement. So if she's focused on Providence for a month, you start to get some things going. But she's dragged into whatever it is, 37 school systems, and they all have separate demands, and they all want to improve.
Well,
there's not a school system that doesn't want to get better and do a better job educating. There's rumors that the state may look to take over another school system.
Which school system is that?
Rumors rampant.
Because now they have 2 right now. They
have 2, but there's a claim that they don't really control Central Falls because there's some...
Well, I was there when the Central Falls deal was created. I was working for...
Started under Sunland and then went
I was working with Sunland, and this was...
Carried forward over in Nalman.
Can I tell you what happened and what didn't happen? You have time for it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Mail is there.
Yeah.
Comes to see Bruce. City Central Falls is broke. We're already paying about 90% of the cost to operate the schools.
Right.
And he relies on the governor to give him some relief and take over the schools. The quid pro quo was supposed to be that was going to be an urban demonstration district, because at that time there was a high school, a middle school, and an elementary school in Central Falls, and the state totally dropped the ball. RIDE blew it. I know no other way of saying it, because it was really short money to come in and take over the whole system if, in fact, it became the demonstration school and you used it as a laboratory to help those kids in Central Falls, but also improve urban education in failing schools. So the intent was good, the objectives were right, so it was there, but the ball was totally dropped, not by Central Falls only, but by the state as well. So that's a little bit of background, on that. But
she's only made a couple of hires at the RIDE level. It took, whatever you want to call it, 6 months to find a superintendent for Providence. They've hired 2 staffers, I believe, to assist him. You know, I move a little more quicker than you do, but I think
I'm slower.
But I think there's a general sense of frustration that if we're going to spark some significant change into these urban school districts, it's got to start happening.
Oh, let me tell you, I think no one would disagree that it took longer than it should have to find a turnaround superintendent. And I can't figure out why. I thought money was the issue, but what this superintendent's being paid is not that much different from what the previous superintendent was being paid. Matter of fact, it was about the same. So it wasn't about, if that was the case, then it wasn't about just money. So it took too long, and when those kinds of hires take too long, the situation develops where you put burdens on the commissioner. She can't do the rest of her job. But more importantly, the community, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but so I say this with a grain of salt. It could be the case that if you don't have a strong leader in place to run an operation, regardless of what the operation is, then it loses a sense of urgency. And so we have just hired a new superintendent. It took too long. We all agree with that. But now let's see how quickly this new superintendent hits the ground. And I think his first job is to restore the sense that the system is still screwed up. It hadn't gotten any, it may not have gotten worse the last 5 months. I'm not sure if it got better. To restore the sense of urgency and the sense of public support and the sense of community about this.
During this period of time, this 5-6 months, to hire a turnaround superintendent, did she make a strategic mistake by not making some of the tough decisions ahead of his arrival? In other words, if you're going to force the Providence Teachers Union to change dramatically, fire the teachers, change the contract, whatever it might be, cancel the busing contract, cancel the maintenance contract, to make this new superintendent come into Providence and be forced to make those changes in his first 30, 60, 90 days is only going to ensure even more chaos.
Well, that's, the point is what kind of staff and resources you need to have to manage change. And so I'm not sure she made a mistake because we didn't have anybody in charge of the Providence school systems. As you pointed out earlier, she was commissioner of education and other responsibilities. And so to go into Providence and create change and chaos and manage that chaos, I'm not sure we had the organizational infrastructure to do that. It gets back to the question of why did it take so long to get the organizational infrastructure? That's the question. I'm not going to second guess that she didn't make the right or wrong decisions. Don't know enough. I just know that you needed the infrastructure, you needed the people so you could manage chaos and manage those changes.
Right.
And we didn't have it quick enough.
Can you achieve a significant improvement in the Providence school system with the existing contracts in place of the key partners, teachers, transportation, maintenance, all these different elements?
I don't know because I don't know the contracts. I know this, that the contract needs to become more kid-centered. They need to be thinner contracts. It's going to be very hard to make change if every time you want to take a day off or get a leave or change the color of chalk on the board or whatever.
Well, you've got 2 things. You've got work to rule, which teachers in this state have implemented that provision. And secondly, you now have evergreen contracts.
Well,
so you move within the framework of the existing contract. It's pretty hard to make any significant change.
Well,
do you have to?
Well, the first thing you have to do is to try your best to work within the provisions of the contract. Try your best to develop good relationships, with the union leadership, and go the extra mile to do that. If it gets to a point where that approach doesn't work, then a state takeover means nothing unless you can make radical change unilaterally. But you don't walk in to make the radical change unilaterally. There are a lot of good teachers in the system. There's a union, there's precedent, there are a whole number of things. And a good manager will recognize that and work with that and try to compromise and move the system forward. But at a certain point, your tolerance and your patience has to expire. And it's easy, and I'm not going to second guess what that point is, but a good manager will know when they hit the wall and that they have to go beyond good practice there.
Well, let's head up to Smith Hill. while you were away lounging in the Caymans, wherever you super rich people go to deposit your money,
Where it's snowing,
untraceable, untaxable, all those types of things.
Sioux City, Iowa, Des Moines,
Nick
Iowa.
Mattiello got himself into a significant number of issues. Let's check off the boxes. Number one is his former campaign consultant, Jeff Britt, is scheduled for trial on March 10th. I think there's a strong expectation that this will not be a one-day trial and that Mr. Britt will have more to say about the goings-on of the 2016 election. Number two, a personal friend, baseball coach to his son, etc., former state trooper, Demers was the head of security at the Convention Center Authority. He got into personnel issues in the building, very serious allegations made by a female coworker. The speaker intervened on his behalf and then threatened and implemented an audit using the Joint Committee on Legislative Services, something that he unilaterally controls by all designations. That was rejected by the Convention Center Authority, deemed to be illegal, and deemed by Bernie Bonanno not exactly a person to enter into political frays. I can't ever remember Bernie Bonanno ever entering into a political fray. He said that was politically motivated by the speaker, and that it was straight out retribution against the Convention Center for trying to take appropriate personnel actions against the speaker's friend.
And the speaker has since withdrawn that position.
Has since withdrawn it, also under a threatened lawsuit by Blake Filippi. The state police have initiated an investigation into this. State police don't investigate misdemeanors, I don't think. I don't think they spend a lot of time on third-tier issues. And a number of other issues have come out relative to how files are being protected and contracts for cleanup firms and all the rest of it. What's this about?
Well, it's obviously about politics, and it's obviously about some missteps the speaker has taken. It's pretty clear that the way the audit was started for the convention center was not good procedure. And how much trouble the speaker's in or is not in, none of us know. We have to wait to see what happens. Red trial, we have to see what happens with the state police investigation. So it could be very minor, or it could be very serious. I don't know, but you have to give the system a chance to find out and report what's going on.
Is JCLS fundamentally flawed?
Yes, and this is what I think. Now you've asked the important question. Thank God.
It takes me a while, but finally I get there.
No, because see, I get a kick out of all these. First the Republicans say this, and the Democrats say this, and who kissed whose sister, and it goes all around. But there's an opportunity here to talk about real reform, which, by the way, I chaired the Blue Ribbon Commission on Legislative Reform, which recommended reducing the size of the legislature, which the people did approve. But it also had a set of recommendations about the Joint Committee on Legislative Services and the legislative budget. And there's a tremendous opportunity here, and I wish people would focus on real reform, because whether the speaker's right or he was wrong, or whether you make some political changes, nothing changes. You just change people who's sitting in what chair.
There is nothing else in state government in which one person oversees a $50 million budget.
Let's talk about the. Well, it's not quite right. But let's talk about what's the legislative budget. If you don't make the structural changes, then all this political stuff is noise. And so the legislative budget. I think people don't understand what the legislative budget is. So I want to take a second to explain it. It's $47 million. That's true, but $13 million is very transparent and very accountable and identified in the budget document. There's $6 million operate the General Assembly. That's legislative pay and the people that run the Assembly. There's another money in the budget for operation of the Auditor General's office, for the House Fiscal Advisory staff, professional agencies. And those are fine budgets. They're very transparent, they're very clear. You know what you're getting from the Auditor General, you know what you're getting from House Fiscal, you know what you're getting from Legislative Counsel. You can argue with part-time lawyers and some political appointments, but that's 13 or 15 million of the budget that is not arbitrarily administered in any way. It's very, very clear. There's another 27 million that goes for the Joint Committee controls, and in theory, that is for the administration of the legislative branch, for personnel, for payroll, for purchasing, for maintenance, and the system needs to be fixed. So if you just correct the political noise that exists right now, whether the speaker was right or wrong, and don't make those structural changes to the Joint Committee, you ain't accomplished anything worth a damn, and you're just gumming. You just, one side's up, one side's down, but at the end of the day, the people get the same problem.
So the 27 million that you described, literally is at the sole discretion of the Speaker of the House?
Well,
there's no meetings.
Well,
there's no votes. There's no minutes.
So how do you fix it? Okay, so there's a couple of things you do. And one thing I'm going to suggest is unpopular politically, but at a certain point, you got to give the House and Senate parity in this Joint Committee. So
what's the fun of being Speaker of the House if you have parity with the Senate?
Well, because there are certain things you can do to manage that parity effectively and still maintain a great deal of authority. So you get parity with the Senate. You have 6 people on the Joint Committee. You put the Senate minority person. But then this is what has to happen to make the legislature work, is you do what any normal business organization would do. The whole thing's a patronage system. Mm-hmm. So you adopt classifications, job descriptions, your performance evaluation, you professionalize the operation of the Joint Committee. Once you professionalize the operation of the Joint Committee, you still have politics, and whether you have 5 or 6 people serving on the board, but the relationship is different. Right. It's not a patronage system; it's a professional system. So the thing I would strongly recommend is that you get rid of the patronage system. You recognize that there's going to be a certain amount of patronage for political appointees that every political institution needs, but by and large, the people that do the administration, the purchasing, the maintenance, make information technology, do that kind of activity, ought to have job descriptions. They ought to be hired based on their qualifications to meet those job descriptions. There ought to be professional management in place that evaluates their performance and then reports back to this board. That's a different dynamic. Right. There's no process that solves problems, but if you have that kind of culture in place, you have a different kind of Joint Committee on Legislative Affairs, whether the Speaker controls it or whether there's parity. The other thing that you need to do, so there's accountability, if you look through budgets, there are cost centers. So there's a cost center in the legislative budget for the Auditor General, for the fiscal staffs, for the Legislative Counsel. Take the Joint Committee's budget and create at least 2 cost centers. One cost center for the Senate and one cost center for the House. I can look at that budget. I can generally read a budget. I can't tell you how much is being spent to operate the House.
No, you have no idea.
And how much to operate the Senate. So those sound like kind of nerdy kind of changes, but they're the important ones. Accountability for the budget, cost centers, professional job descriptions. So people are hired based on where they meet the job descriptions. Patronage, evaluation of those people. So professional people are evaluating them, who then deal with their bosses, who are the elected officials, who are the Joint Committee.
How does this get forced through? If I'm the Speaker of the House, I haven't had a meeting. There hasn't been a meeting in arguably 8 or 10 years. Nick Mattiello's never had a meeting. Blake Filippi just found out he's the secretary of the Joint Committee on Legislative Services.
Well, somebody said no good crisis should go unused.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe there'll be enough public concern and enough public heat that there'll be a come to Jesus meeting, and we'll be able to get these kinds of reforms, because these are reforms that we've spoken and written about for over a decade now. Right. And they're the basic things that I won't sit here and tell you that that's automatically going to result in better government, because form doesn't make the function absolutely better, but I know those are the kinds of safeguards you put in place. I'm going to repeat myself if you don't mind. Job descriptions, hire people that meet the job descriptions, performance evaluations, promote people.
Accountability, just basic accountability. In the last 2 minutes, today's Iowa, the caucuses are going on. What will we know tomorrow that we don't know today?
Well, Iowa will still be the corn state.
That was Nebraska's the corn state.
Is that the way? Anyhow, they'll still be for ethanol.
Yeah.
I used to live in Iowa. I lived in Western Iowa for a while. But I think you'll get some idea of who will come out of Iowa, or is it 3 or 4, contenders. And I think
if Bernie Sanders wins, which he feels very confident based on the narrative of the past few days, and Joe Biden finishes 4th.
That could be a problem with Joe Biden, but it won't be a problem for Mike Bloomberg.
Yeah. And is that the trade-out, that if Biden underperforms in Iowa and New Hampshire, the moderate part of the party then says, sorry, Joe, it ain't going to happen. We're going to go over to Bloomberg.
It's too early to know, because Nevada and South Carolina come right down on that tail, and he may perform well there. But look at this. So we have all this noise about Bernie possibly going to win.
Yep.
I'm going to look at the delegate count, because the interesting thing, I attended caucuses years ago when I lived there. The interesting thing about the caucus is if you don't get 15%,
right.
You've got to negotiate. You've got to use your vote somewhere else. So I'm going to look at how many delegates come out actually. Mm-hmm. And so if, for example, I'll just use a arbitrary number, I don't know how many delegates are from Iowa to the Democrat convention, but let's say Bernie Sanders gets 15 delegates and Joe Biden comes in 3rd and gets 10 delegates. Then you got to put that in perspective. They finished Iowa, and one guy is 5 delegates behind the other guy.
Right.
That's what it means. So it'll be nuanced. The talking heads will report it in a certain way. But I tell people, I expect that Sanders will win. He seems to have the momentum on the ground. But look at who comes in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and could be a close 5th. Those are the 5 people that'll get a ticket out. And then the second thing to look at, which is really important, is what is the difference in delegates. If the winner gets 5 more delegates than the person in 2nd place, and the person in 2nd place gets 3.
The headlines won't pay much attention to that part.
I know, but when the Democrats get to Milwaukee this summer, that will be important.
Gary Sasse, listen, I feel more wealthy just having Gary Sasse here. And I don't mean intellectually more wealthy. I mean just the dripping of the osmosis of the money man sitting next to me. I want to thank Gary Sasse and Jay Round for being here today. We'll be back tomorrow in the new studios. Kate Nagel will be at the helm. I think she's got Jennifer Lawless, which will be a must-see interview tomorrow. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Over and out at Go Local Live.